today's topic is just going to be about product design and Web3, how we kind of see those intersect. And I think in terms of the agenda, pretty straightforward. I'll give a quick introduction. We'll talk a little bit about kind of some core concepts that we see being really relevant when it comes to thinking about product design and how it intersects with Web3. And then we'll walk through a quick case study and have some time for Q&A after. So yeah, I think as a quick intro, I'm Jeffrey. It's good to meet everybody. I am one of the co-founders of Slope. Just for context there, Slope is an end-to-end creative agency that's hyper-focused on working with startups. We were started as an agency by founders for founders. And for some background there, my co-founder, Karina, and I have spent our careers both working in-house at a bunch of different tech companies and starting some of our own venture-backed businesses in the past too. And so really just wanted to build an agency and a services business that was highly catered towards working with early and growth stage startups. From a service standpoint, we generally work across three larger buckets. So the first is brand. We do a ton of brand strategy and positioning work, a lot of visual identity work. So things like logo, type, color, how does all of that come together as a brand system? Our second kind of bucket that we work a lot on is digital. So we do a lot of web design and dev. And then obviously the focus of today's talk, a lot of UI, UX work there as well. And then finally, we do a decent amount of retainer work where we're just working on campaigns or ad creatives, things of that nature. And then just for some context here, we also work with a lot of Web3 companies. I'd say about half of our client base historically is in Web3. And we just feel like there's a lot of really great opportunity for great design to make high business impact in such a nascent space. And we'll kind of get into some of those principles obviously in a bit. But with that being said, let's chat a little bit about product design. I think for talks like this, where I often find it helpful to start is just with definitions. And I think this is obviously a little bit of a traditional definition of product design and probably one that you guys have all heard and are familiar with, but we generally think of product design as, this intersection or combination between user experience or UX and user interface, so UI, right? And UX being, flows, how the customer moves to the product and the app, and UI being the interface and components that kind of visually show and make up the product itself. But I think oftentimes this definition can be a little bit rigid for the purposes of a talk like this. And I think it's often helpful to think about an alternate definition of product design, or at least one that I want to just keep in mind as we kind of chat through the slides today. And that's one where we think a little bit more about maybe the goals of product design being around creating intuitive, delightful user touch points and experiences. And where product design then itself is sort of the practice of creating and systemizing those touch points, right? And I think the reason why this kind of alternate definition is important is especially in a world like Web3, where there's so much inherent complexity, it's such a new and nascent space, and often one that's even politicized, right? In many different ways, there's many kind of different external sides to what Web3 looks like and means to different people. Having really great, simple design that distills these inherently beautiful and simple user experiences is especially important in that context and backdrop. And so I think kind of with that in mind, I want to talk about a few key principles for design in Web3. I think this is sort of the bulk of what we want to focus on for the talk today. So things that we've just learned as an agency from working with Web3 products day in, day out, and things that we feel like are really important from a philosophical standpoint and also kind of tactical things underneath. So I think the four things we really want to talk about today are number one, designing for comprehension. The second is designing for magic, so more magical experiences. The third is designing in a very open, composable world. And the fourth is around designing for your user. So we'll kind of go through each of these sort of high-level concepts, starting with designing for comprehension. So I think just to talk about comprehension a little bit, and kind of reference this a little bit earlier around the fact that Web3 often encapsulates a lot of complexity, right? I think that's just the nature of the space in many ways. And this complexity is often both technical. So, from a new technology standpoint, concepts like decentralization, cryptography, a lot of complex maths oftentimes. And this complexity is also experiential, right? In the sense that users in the space of Web3 are often playing new roles that they haven't before, right? Custodying their own funds, having ownership in protocols, participating in governance. These are kind of net new experiences for a lot of users and consumers in the space. And so I think the combination of these two and the intersection of the fact that we have both technical and experiential complexity makes comprehension kind of a really important topic in the space, which is kind of naturally the question of how can we design simple, delightful experiences when working in such a complex problem space. And so I think a few kind of tactical tips here that when we think about comprehension, the first is this idea around training your users as being a really key way to drive comprehension when we think about UI UX. And to give a bit of background, when we often think about an app or a website or a protocol, we think of it as a scoped universe. And what we mean by that is that when users are on your app or your website, within that universe of that domain, they expect things to behave similarly and in consistent ways. So I think a really simplistic example of this is that like a dropdown on one page should probably behave in a very similar way to a dropdown that exists on another page on your site. And I think the reason why consistency is so important for comprehension is by creating really consistent systems where the app and the universe that the user is living in behaves in ways that are expected, you end up creating really positive impacts around faster onboarding, faster education and understanding how these interfaces work, and less mental load for the end user. And so I think like a really tangible example of this is, for example, just looking at Aave here. So as most of you probably know, Aave is a lending protocol. So you can either supply tokens or borrow tokens at a certain APY. And I think what's really neat is if you go through the actual flows and even looking at the screenshots here, even though there's small minor differences between how the supply and borrow side work in terms of information displayed and kind of smaller micro interactions, the larger structural system feels very familiar. And even looking at these two modals, structurally, they share a very similar component system and UI library and look and feel. And I think this is really important because it would have been very easy to make these flows completely divergent, feel completely different. But the net benefit that they receive by having this kind of consistency is that if you are somebody who has ever supplied on the supply side on Aave, you already have become implicitly trained by consistent product design to understand how to borrow as well. So there's almost this natural acceleration in the onboarding curve for a user because of how consistent components app-wise or across the global scope of Aave as a protocol are. I think then the second thing that we want to think about kind of beyond consistency is time as a variable. I think this is also a really key tactical way to help drive comprehension and simplicity when there's a lot of complexity at hand. And so the way we often think about this is when you're working with complex information, right, or complicated flows, it's really easy to just dump all of that information on your end user and kind of just let them figure it out. But I think one kind of axis that we often find either like, more junior designers or new founders kind of not thinking as much about is this idea of time being an axis when it comes to product design. And the fact that you can strategically kind of trickle in informations in little bite-sized pieces and packets kind of throughout a flow to create a more digestible, easy to understand and kind of more calming experience. I think like just to kind of talk about a tangible example here in a very similar way, I think a lot of DEXs kind of exemplify this concept where if we look at this one here, this is CowSwap, for example, but I think this is just pretty universally true for most DEXs. At each step of the flow, what you'll notice is that a lot of new information is kind of trickled in very strategically, right? So we have this initial state here where things are just pretty clear. There's an input and an output. It's clear to me that this module is some sort of swap functionality. As you then start to kind of connect your wallet, select the tokens, they'll start to trickle in information, right, about the balances that you have available. And then when you go to actually enter inputs to swap, you'll start to see the actual tangible numbers around slippage, price, fees, et cetera. And I think it would have been very easy, I think, when designing a DEX from scratch, like if we forgot what this experience was like, to just dump all of this information much earlier in step 1 or 2. But instead, I think having kind of that, the relevant information strategically trickled in at the right point in time throughout the flow actually makes this a lot more modular, a lot more digestible, and a lot more easy to understand for the end user. And so I think that overall leads to a more comprehensive and less overwhelming solution. I think the third kind of subpoint around comprehension and the last one that I want to leave everyone with is just this idea around educating your users. This one's probably the most obvious, but one that I feel like often we forget about in Web3, which is that sometimes it's best just to tell people what's happening. And that's kind of the best way to drive clarity. And so this example is from Matcha, which is obviously the DEX from the 0x team. And I think the one moment that I thought was really nice and delightful when playing around with it was this wallet connect flow. I think we've all probably pretty used to wallet connect flows just being that classic modal where you just select one of the wallets and there's not really any other information that's available. And I think what they've done a really good job with here is just dropping in this really nice educational and informational moment, right? So there's in this modal, a lot of real estate dedicated to, hey, what is a wallet in the first place, right? How do you use it? What are the benefits? There's even an out, so a CTA to get a new wallet if you don't have a wallet already. And for users that are more experienced and maybe are more familiar, they can kind of have that classic experience on the left-hand side. So to me, this feels like a very dynamic, much more sophisticated version of a Wallet Connect module that benefits kind of a wider set of users and provides a lot of education and informational clarity for a certain subset that might often be a little bit more confused. Cool. So I think in summary, when we think about designing for comprehension, I feel like the key points that we want to just keep in mind are training your users, right? So remembering that consistency across UI systems and components leads naturally to easier onboarding and more expected behavior from users that are the end users of your app. Considering time as a variable to simplify flows, right? So just trying to trickle in information strategically, and then just education as a really easy go-to that can just simply help clarify more complicated concepts. Cool. So I think the second concept that we kind of wanted to talk about is this idea around designing for magic and how that applies to Web3. So oftentimes, this is like a really interesting one for us because Web3 presents a pretty unique opportunity and moment in time to rebuild a lot of traditional systems, right? Whether they're financial systems or governance systems or digital art systems, whatever it might be. It's kind of a modern rethinking with obviously blockchain technology and infrastructure in the back end on how these systems can be better.
Let's turn it down.
Can
you bring up Nina, you're off mute.
Oh, it's okay. I thought that was a question. But yeah, I think in general, when we think about rebuilding some of these traditional systems, it's easy to have a simple baseline and muscle to be like, as long as the experience is better than what exists today, that's totally fine, right? As long as we're scoring somewhere above our Web2 comp, then we should feel okay about our UI and UX. And I think this is actually a really big missed opportunity, right? Because when we kind of have this unique opportunity to rebuild traditional systems, I think we also inherently have an opportunity to think about how to make them significantly more magical than they are today. And so I think the first kind of sub point when we talk about tactically how to design more magical systems is basically about how to make things simpler, right? What's the easiest way to take these kind of more convoluted things that have existed historically and simplify them? And I think one example that really encapsulated this for me, especially during like the beginning and the boom of like, not the beginning, I guess, overall, but the boom of DeFi summer was when it came to yield farming. I think that the LP farming process, for example, was just unnecessarily complex. So, you know, the 4-step process that you kind of had to go through, and a lot of you guys are probably familiar with, is, you know, you had to acquire first 2 equal token pair values. So like equal value amounts of 2 token assets. You had to add both to a pool to receive these LP tokens in exchange. Those LP tokens represented your ownership share in the pool, and you had to then deposit those into a farm. And then you had to check back regularly and collect your yield, right? And I think it would have been very easy to say that this is fine, right? This is a fine experience because, hey, you can't even do this in Web2. Traditional financial institutions are just as complicated and convoluted. And net, this is arguably a better experience to make money. But I think that kind of undercuts the fact that there was this really good opportunity to build something significantly more magical, right? If we think about that same process and we really consider the end customer goals, it could have just been a 2-step process, right? Almost no one is just holding those LP tokens and not doing anything with them. These intermediate steps are almost completely unnecessary and could have been automated by software, at least for a specific subset of users. And it could have been a really magical 2-step process. Deposit some sort of token amount. The protocol will either split it automatically on its own, or you can deposit a pair and then automatically collect yield, right? And this would have been a really magical experience that felt much, much better than, you know, using traditional financial systems and bringing in a lot of that magic that Web3 allows. I think on a kind of related note, we also think a little bit about how software is really dynamic and how that can be kind of a core factor to help drive these more magical experiences. So sometimes it's not just about simplification, it's about personalization. And so the kind of underlying context here is often when we're working with clients and founders, we see this kind of mistake of designing for beautiful Figma frames versus designing for beautiful software. And what we mean by that, it's really easy to basically get lost in this process and try to create kind of the perfect static Figma frame that looks really great. It looks really great in the flow. We're going to ship it. And I think it's easy to forget that there's this really powerful underlying machine that's driving all of these Figma artboards, and that there's a lot of really cool stuff we can do with software as a result. And this MetaMask example on the right-hand side, I think is an example of like a really big missed opportunity to kind of have that magic come through via dynamic software. So when you go to select a network on MetaMask, for me at least, they displayed Ethereum and then Linea and Smart Chain. And I've never transacted on Linea in my life for what it's worth. And a lot of the chains that I do transact on are much, much further down the list. And I think there's a missed software opportunity here to really personalize this list, right? To actually show much more relevant options for me as a user on an individual level and have software drive these more magical, seamless experiences. And so I think the thing we just want to encourage here is don't forget that there's software powering every screen that you're building, and try to think about opportunities to let that software create more magical moments for your end user. I think a similar example of something that was done actually well is I think this is like a really nice data visualization moment from like a governance perspective, where software allows us to create these really dynamic visualizations of proposals and voting proposals. And it's a really delightful moment, right? Because it's something that I think you would never see traditionally in Web2. It's this really unique visualization that's really easy to grasp. And I think it's something that does take advantage of the fact that, hey, we can connect the actual vote quantity with like a very tangible, beautiful visualization that makes a lot of logical sense to the end user. Cool. I think the second sub point here around making things magical is just not to be boring. So I feel like this is something that we think about a lot, which is as the world has sort of evolved and frameworks and UI systems have become easier to use, for lack of a better word, it often feels like much of the world of software design and product starts to look like it was all created with out-of-the-box Tailwind components. And that's totally okay. But I think we would urge everyone to maybe just think about a world where things can be a bit more interesting and magical, right? And our UI itself doesn't have to just be only hyper-functional. It can also bring in these kind of delightful little moments that bridge the gap between, say, brand design and product design, or maybe bring in little moments of personalization that are really nice for the end user. And so 2 examples here that I think do this really well are Phantom obviously did a rebrand recently, and I think they did a great job integrating even into a very functional wallet product, a lot of little brand moments. This is obviously that cover screen you see when you first log in, but like it's nice just to see the logo, the brand moment play a bit more of a hero message. And then Family on the right-hand side, again, another wallet, but for their mobile app, releasing the ability to customize individual icons so that it feels a little more personal. I think these little things are really delightful. And I think they often get deprioritized in a product roadmap because it's hard to assign and attribute business value. But as a system, if we can build a culture of continuing to integrate these moments into our product, we feel like it leads to a lot of really delightful experiences. I think just to kind of talk a little bit more about this too for 1 second, because often we also hear that like maybe this feels like it's only applicable to like consumer products. But one thing that we want to know that's really important is that these moments of delight are equally relevant for infrastructure, dev tools, kind of larger things that maybe feel like they have less consumer touch points as well. Tableland on the left-hand side is a client that we've worked with on a lot of this strat and brand stuff. And one of the things that was really key and interesting for them is basically releasing this NFT collection. So Tableland is basically an NFT metadata layer. And essentially, they released this NFT collection of basically these really unique kind of explorer vehicles and built this whole world and brand world and system around it to kind of benefit their initial community. And we felt like this is like a really delightful, nice moment where they were able to integrate it pretty closely to the product and also do a lot of world building for something that it would have been really easy to opt out and do something kind of quite boring and vanilla for as a DevTools product. And I think similarly on the right-hand side, sometimes this delightful and magical moments can come also from the product and feature itself. So with Alchemy releasing the ChatGPT plugin, for example, I know early days, but seems like there's something that could be interesting with integrating new software and technology on the infrastructure side to kind of drive some of this magic. Cool. So I think in summary, for designing for magic, I think that the key points that we want to keep in mind are just using software to simplify where possible, using software to personalize where possible as well, and remembering that we're building dynamic systems, and then bringing in magic delightful moments, even if they're not purely functional. Cool. So I think on to then the third example here. So this is around designing for composability. And so I think this is a pretty unique one to Web3 and systems that we're building in Web3. And obviously, this kind of open composable world that we live in presents a lot of interesting opportunities. But I think inherently as well, composability also presents a lot of interesting design challenges. And one of the biggest things that we often see is in a world that's so composable, users are often, even if I'm like a DEX or I'm building a very specific protocol, they're interacting with multiple products throughout the experience, some of which are not owned by the company themselves, right? And I think that it's easy to pretend that that is not the responsibility of your protocol and that you are only responsible for the screens that are native to your app. But I think oftentimes that leads to really poor product experiences. I think one really tangible example I think we can show is sort of shown in this video. So this is Uniswap, obviously, but the interesting thing is when I go click buy on Uniswap, I get kicked out without really any warning or context into a separate flow that's run by MoonPay. And as a new user, I might not have any idea what MoonPay is. It's quite a jarring experience. All of a sudden, this modal pops up with a new logo and different type and colors. And it's just I think, very strange experience. And to me, this feels like a missed opportunity in the sense that if a user is using Uniswap and they encounter this flow, they're going to be confused. And I feel like it is the responsibility in some ways, even though we're working with composable protocols. If we're composing with MoonPay in this instance, it's important to educate that end user about what they're getting kicked into, what MoonPay does, sort of easing them into that experience, right? I think a similar example of this too, just to kind of go to the next screen. And again, not trying to pick on Uniswap here. I think just a easy example to kind of take a look at. I think most DEXs do this, but a similar concept kind of applies to when we look at larger token lists, right? If I search ETH, for example, I get this huge sort of unsorted, unordered list of basically ETH, various versions of wrapped and staked ETH, and it's all kind of confusing and a little bit overwhelming and hard to find what I'm actually looking for. And I think, again, this is something around where it's easy as a protocol for me to say that it's not my responsibility to order these tokens and that my job as Uniswap is to just be an unopinionated DEX that, permissionlessly lets people, set up any token pair for swapping, right? And I think that that's fine, but I feel like it doesn't lead necessarily to the best user experience. And even though maybe it is in some ways, the blame is shared that the tokens could be named in a way that's a bit more logical or grouped in a way that's a bit more logical. There is also an opportunity, I think, from the Uniswap side to group these in a way that makes a lot more sense to the end user. And so I think trying not to off-put the responsibility of UI UX work just because we're living in a composable ecosystem is I think, an important point here. Cool. Let me see. Oops, I think it skipped a slide. There we go. I think the other point that I'll make is that when we think about composability too, one thing that we see often happen in such open, kind of transparent ecosystems is a lot of commoditization of UI. And this is less a larger point or a tactical point, but something I would just want everyone to kind of ask themselves, which is maybe it's not such a good thing that every DEX and lending protocol and governance form, et cetera, all kind of shares the exact same UI. And maybe there's an interesting opportunity here to rethink things from a first principles basis and come up with interface and interactions that are really unique to what we're building, and kind of capture the nuances of our individual customers. And so in summary, I think when we think about designing for composability, things to keep in mind are just not assuming that the UI of other protocols is the responsibility of theirs alone. And that because if your users touch them, you should design with them in mind as well. And the second thing is not letting openness become an out to not think about design from a first principle standpoint. Cool. I think the last point we'll talk about here is from a principle standpoint is just designing for your end user. So a lot of design in Web3, at least a lot of bad design, I think can be attributed to sort of designing for the wrong end user, if that makes sense. Instead, I think what we want to think about more deeply is how to create designs from a first principles basis and understand who your unique users are and what do they want and need. So kind of related to that last point that we were making there. And so the first kind of sub point to this principle, I think, is just to design for your users' level of understanding. Every product is really different. I think it's important to optimize design to ensure that it's understandable and effective for your user base specifically, right? And I think every protocol, every company has a very different shape and size of user base. I think a good example of two protocols that I think do a good job with design, or two companies that do a good job with design, but in a very different way given their user base, is Blur and OpenSea, right? So if we look at OpenSea on the right-hand side, it's obviously more of a place to kind of browse a lot of NFTs. Maybe it's for more casual collectors that are looking to look at collections. It's a bit more visual as a result. And I think this is effective design for their end customer. And I think on the Blur side, right, it's a little bit more trader focused. And so I feel like their design and their product design decisions have led them to be something that's a little bit more gridded, a little bit more structured, a little bit more data heavy. And I think this kind of divergence is a good thing, right? We should think about who our end users are and not just kind of create protocols that look like everyone else in our space, but ones that are actually more tailored and specific to who our end user we're designing for is. So challenge those, I guess, initial assumptions. I think this concept also extends beyond just like visual design, but also to copy as well. I think very often we see copy that's created without really thinking too much about the end user, and it leads to kind of these jarring, off-putting moments. So one example here is on the left-hand side, we have some copy from Abe. This was interesting. I was coming across this as I was putting together this presentation, actually, but I don't hold any DAI in my wallet. And they gave me this little error at the bottom that just told me my Ethereum wallet was empty. And I thought I had gotten hacked for a second or someone had drained my wallet. And it was a really scary moment for me. And I think that this feels like an example where copy could have been more considerate of who the end user is, the situation they're in when they're reading it, and how to design it in a way that's a bit more encompassing. I think on the right-hand side, a little less literal around the copy itself, but Etherscan, I think, is also an example of a place where there's a lot of, wallet addresses, contract addresses, and I think it ends up creating a very text-heavy design experience. And I would argue that even for, the most native on-chain crypto users, it's very hard to look at this and just immediately be like, oh, yeah, that's the USDT contract address, right? And so I think there's an opportunity to instead turn these long text strings into something that's a bit more human readable, or into interfaces that are a bit more usable. I think the second kind of sub point around designing for your users is kind of a counterpoint to a complaint that we often hear, which is when we're working with companies or protocols that are designing for pro users, let's say like pro traders or people that are a lot more crypto native, it's often used as an excuse to make things overly complex. But I think I would like to just push back against that a little bit. Just because someone is interacting with things on chain every day doesn't mean that they can't appreciate good seamless design, right? And that it doesn't have a big impact on your product at the end of the day. This is something that I created on Twitter a long time ago, but just as a simple example, this is a little bit out of date because I think they've updated their UI since then. But this is for Synapse, which was a bridge back then. And then essentially what I felt like was Synapse was probably targeted a little bit more at people that were doing stuff on chain already, not necessarily users that were net new to crypto. But I think the way they displayed a lot of information, the hierarchy, the coloring, ended up making things more complex and feeling more sophisticated than they needed to be. And so I think just wanted to kind of look at on the right-hand side, the same example of like a UI that could work just as well for pro traders or people that have a lot of activity on chain. It has all the same information, but especially around the slippage, around the fees, done so in a way that is just a little bit more digestible and visually clean and simple. And so I think in summary, when we think about designing for our users, the important things to really consider here are A, designing for their level of understanding, both from like a UI and a copy standpoint, and B, not ignoring kind of first principles, design principles, even if you're designing for a more sophisticated or seasoned user base. I will pause here. And maybe we can go into some questions, but hopefully that was helpful just in terms of a high level understanding of how we think about the intersection of product design and Web3.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jeffrey. That was very, very helpful. One question I saw was from Frankie and Steph around tips for balancing building delightful moments or focusing on speed. Frankie and Steph, do you want to unmute and come ask that question?
Thank you so much. I think delightful moments are something that we talk about a lot as a team, but it always kind of comes down to the question of like, should we just get this out today instead of spending a couple more days, adding fun, delightful animations or whatever you may see. So I just would love to know like how you think about it and kind of how you make decisions around that.
Yeah, it's a good question. Obviously, I think like to your point, in an ideal world, we could just add a lot of those kind of really complex, nice front end moments everywhere throughout the app. I think the way that I think about it, if it ends up becoming a prioritization question, which naturally is probably the case for most startups, is think about where in the app or flow do those delightful moments have the highest impact for your end user, right? So maybe it's like a really high touch screen by traffic. Or maybe it's, let's say there's a part in your flow where users get really nervous or things feel really confusing. Maybe in moments like that, adding some more calming and easing animation starts to contribute a lot more equity to the business. Or maybe there's a big milestone that a user accomplishes in your app, right? Investing in, I think, those psychological peaks where we feel like we would get a lot more business and brand value from having delightful moments there is probably a good way to prioritize instead of just being like, let's linearly run through and add animation every single screen. Because I agree that, that does end up slowing you down. So your whole app doesn't have to be kind of quote unquote delightful to the extreme in every sense. I think of it more like almost like a symphony, right? Where are those moments where we really peak? Where are the moments in our app and flow where having that delight actually creates outsized impact versus being just somewhere that is a bit more standard?
Thank you.
Great. Let's go to Thomas next. Thomas, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
I just curious, like, what like signals or like are you looking at, or like at what point would you advocate for like bifurcating the flow based on your user segments, even if they're doing the same end action, right? So you kind of use the example of like pro traders versus retail traders. And so I guess when you're thinking about building a new product, right, you kind of have this spectrum of users, how knowledgeable they are, what their intents are. And how do you essentially find what are those distinctions across that spectrum of saying, okay, well, one flow, even though it would work for the majority of users, like I should actually have two flows, or maybe, advanced a pro trader flow and a retail trader flow isn't even enough. Maybe you should have three like flows. I guess, yeah. Like what like data points, what signals are you looking at to drive those decisions?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think it's a really hard one to have like a objective answer to, if that makes sense. That is kind of like a one size fits all answer, because in many ways it's very specific to every company, their user base, the behavior that they're seeing. This is going to be a little bit of a non-answer, but hopefully a helpful one to think about. Like, I think in some ways it should be kind of obvious from talking to your users and just spending more time with them over time. At least that's what we find, which is like, sometimes one standard flow is totally fine, right? And it's a trade-off decision, because if you have like a product that has both pro traders and retail users on it, maybe that consistency is a really good thing. But I think sometimes when you're talking to users, if you find that like, hey, we have a clearly defined ICP segment that's just constantly getting tripped up, and they make up a substantial portion of our user base, where we're not really willing to just cut them out of the user experience, then maybe it starts to make sense to bifurcate, right? And I think the other thing to note too is this decision can also change over time, right? As education of your user base evolves, as maybe your user base itself evolves as well, right? Like, I think a little bit even about like how Coinbase had Coinbase and Coinbase Pro as completely separate experiences, and then they kind of ended up merging them back in together over time. I think that those were both individually the right decisions at those moments in time, if that makes sense, probably given how they were seeing their user base change and people use the product. So a little bit of a non-answer. I'm happy to try to shed light on like other angles or ways of thinking about it. But I think in some ways it just comes down to who your users are, how much they care, how much of a percentage of your user base do they make. And that kind of naturally leads to sort of a first principles answer on how much should we prioritize the effort to build out a separate flow for them.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah. The other thing I'll add, one other thing to tack on there too, is like, sometimes you can get away with having one flow, and the solution doesn't have to be two completely separate flows. So I think a lot about even that matcha example with the DEX and the Wallet Connect flow. Like, I think that's a flow that works equally well for pro users as well as new ones, just in terms of giving some education on the side and giving new users an out to kind of kick into a whole separate path, but allowing pro users to kind of connect in the more standard traditional way.
Makes sense. Cool. Thank you.
Awesome. Let's go to Nick next.
My question is about balancing customization with consistency. So we're building a very, very customizable, interoperable product. And I guess similar to like a Dune dashboard, things can live anywhere, which makes it very hard on any particular one of those pages for a user to know, especially from like a systematic design perspective, where the buttons are going to be or the points of interest. Do you have any heuristics or like rules that we could use to sort of design a layout of a very customizable space that would, make sense for users and have some level of consistency?
Yeah, it's a good question. Sorry, just to make sure I'm understanding this correctly too. So the main problem that we're trying to figure out is because kind of like Dune, the dashboards and the pages are very customizable, so they could reorder, kind of put things where they want. The question is almost how do we create consistency in a world where there's not much customization? Or let me know if I'm misunderstanding.
That is 100% what I'm asking, yes.
Yeah. I think maybe some general things to think about if it's helpful. One is even in worlds where modules are quite customizable and interoperable, like you could switch the order of things where things kind of live, it becomes increasingly more important for them to share a base design language then, in that case, if that makes sense. Because then visually things will kind of compose in a way where it doesn't really matter the end custom order the user chooses. We have a design system that's flexible enough where everything can kind of live harmoniously. The other thing to think about here is kind of just generally visual hierarchy, right? So even in a page where users are customizing things, they're probably not customizing the entire page, right? So there's still wayfinding, little moments from like a type hierarchy perspective, things that we can do to structure the information, even though the order itself is more customizable. But yeah, I know that's probably more high level advice. Happy to dive into more specifics if you want to chat later too about ways to kind of make it work for you guys.
Cool. Thanks.
The next question that we had was from Christoph.
So yeah, hi. So you said people overemphasize Figma, but I found it actually useful for two things. One, it actually just allows me to actually just visualize the whole thing and how the whole just user flow goes. And two, if I try to explain people how the whole product is, it's hard to explain and it's hard to actually get feedback from people. People only give feedback when they actually see something really that they can actually touch and feel. And then, yeah, my question is like, how much emphasis should we do on Figma? Because I found it, just personally very useful to actually try to get feedback and actually get my thoughts on the whole just flow of users.
It's a great question. I think maybe to clarify a little bit too, I love Figma. I spent half my life in Figma. But I think that what the larger point that I wanted to kind of emphasize there was not necessarily like, don't use Figma as a great design tool. Everyone should design in Figma if it makes sense for their systems. It's a great tool. And people should use Figma to prototype and gather feedback. That's awesome. I think maybe the more subtle point that I was trying to kind of express and is it's often tempting to design for things to be amazing on Figma, but forget that there's a lot of opportunity for software to personalize even beyond what you might be able to show in a Figma artboard, right? So that example of like the MetaMask networks was more around like, it's easy to get in this pattern of optimizing for the best Figma screen. But I think what is important to not forget while designing in Figma is that there is opportunity for personalization and for software to add a layer of complexity and dimension beyond what you could express in just an artboard. And to keep that in mind as we build things out.
Okay, that's a good comment. Like, I just found it useful, like, okay, just users need this. And I actually need to make the software to actually match the Figma experience.
Yeah. Figma is a great prototype user feedback tool. So I would definitely like take advantage of that as much as possible. So agreed on that point for sure.
Awesome. Okay, now let's go to Dan.
I wrote Jeffrey that, and we talk about, or at least, we talk about like UX being such an issue all the time and visual design in crypto. Like, I think that's a hurdle that keeps a lot of normies and newbies out of the space. So I'm just curious if you're willing for you to call out like specific apps or projects that you think have actually nailed this. I mean, there's certainly something across like the DeFi land is at least that a lot of the best known names have have a visual style that we all recognize, and they have all got their cute little animal logo, you know. But any that you think like go deeper with design and have gotten it right for these guys to look to as a model?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's always interesting when I get asked like, what are specific like companies or protocols that have done an amazing job with design? Because there's so many, but I think it just depends a little bit on what their user internal business goals and needs are. So it's hard to say like what has been kind of the most effective. I definitely think like some of the recent players have been spending a lot of time thinking about UX in a way that really shows. Like, I feel like Family is a nice example of that from like a wallet perspective of just rethinking how we can make this a more like seamless, delightful experience. The other thing that I'll kind of say, which is a little bit tangential to this, is often, I know the focus of today's talk was more on UI UX, but often when it comes to things feeling too technical or too daunting or too alienating in crypto, it's actually a brand problem too. So it's the fact that we're leaning too heavily into motifs like dark mode or 8-bit when we're really going after retail traders or something, right? Or like we're branding in a way that feels almost inherently unwelcoming or unfriendly. Or maybe it's the opposite, right? Maybe brand kind of goes both ways. So you can also look too friendly if you're trying to be really serious and institutional and infrastructural, right? And so I think oftentimes it's actually more due to kind of mimetic effects we see in brand of just like every crypto project wanting to look like the previous coolest crypto project before them, rather than think about what kind of brand work makes the most sense for them. And that's actually where a lot of the alienating effect comes from, in our opinion, versus like more tactical UI UX stuff sometimes. So I think two kind of angles there if helpful.
Thank you. Looks like we got another question from Natalie in the chat.
The general question is, how do you think about UI UX in natural language tooling around Web3? I mean, I think it's a pretty unexplored area right now. And so we're just thinking a little bit about Symbol, which launched yesterday, which has some of this. And just with what you see with even Shopify and ways that you can effectively use natural language to enhance an existing UI. Just curious if you guys have thought about that at all.
It's a great question. I don't have any like particularly formed thoughts or theses around this, but I think it's cool, right? I feel like natural language models and like LLMs are undoubtedly a very powerful piece of technology. I think a lot of Web2 products have already started to adopt them and integrate in ways that are pretty seamless. I don't know, from like a UI UX standpoint, I guess it feels like it could introduce a lot of like more seamless integrated moments. Like I feel like where I think AI is sometimes used in ways that don't feel like they benefit UI UX too much is like, this is the same product that we had before, and now we have a chatbot, right? Like that feels like a, like sort of a overly simplistic way to just drop AI into your product. And I feel like from a UI UX standpoint, I would think about like, what can AI magically do for users and integrate into workflows that they're already doing in your product? And so almost being less about like coming in the form of a chatbot, but like, even if the underlying technology powering it is a language model, how can it actually like take actions or integrate or surface information in smart and clever ways to your end user at the right point in time in the flow, instead of just dropping an intercom like chat on the product. So yeah, I don't have too many thoughts, but I think it's exciting for sure. I'm excited to see what kind of happens.
Yeah, what's been most interesting to me is the ways that products are effectively creating their own integrations that can make a product more usable in complex spaces. So I think Shopify is a really good example of this, where, you know, if it works as they say, right, you can actually edit your website, or like a Webflow integration would be great if you could be like, change this. But anyway, just that's where I'm coming from. So thanks.
Yeah, it'll be cool to see all of it play out, for sure.
Okay, it looks like we have time for 1 to 2 more questions. I know, Christoph, you had another question.
Yeah, so we have actually made different just user personas. So how should we just optimize on that? Should we just take one and work on that? Or should we take like a common value just across user personas and try to like, because we have like six different user personas. So like, how should we make the choice about optimizing for specific user persona?
I think user personas are really helpful as like a tool in terms of like how to use it to make better choices, or simplifying even the set of user personas. Again, I think it's going to depend a little bit on what you're building and the specifics there, right? For some companies, maybe it just makes sense to be hyper-focused on one persona and build for that use case. For others, maybe having a wider range makes sense. In terms of like how to simplify that set, if you guys have like a bunch, like 6 user personas, for example, I think you're on the right track. I would say like, I would just try to think about what psychographically they have in common, right? You might have 6 very demographically different personas, or, things that are slightly different about how you might define them. But undoubtedly, there probably is some shared pain point that they have, which is why you're using the product. And so, especially in the early days, I think just honing in and really doubling down on that pain point and solving that is probably a universal enough solution for all the personas. But I guess hard to say specifically the tactful thing to do without knowing more about what you guys are building. But in general, if you feel like you're struggling with too many personas, I would just not let them become like too rigid or structured too much around your decision making in the early days, and just try to focus on the commonalities and build around that.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks.
Let's do one final question. This one is from Bethany. Bethany, if you want to ask the final question of the day. One question that I have is, given the peer-to-peer nature of collaboration and the open source mindset in Web3, how would you recommend that brands encourage community-led design elements to either like the core or sort of like, sidecar modular components of their product without sort of diluting that brand image too much?
Yeah, this is a very difficult question. I don't think anyone's really cracked it yet, but I think it's one where there's a few things that I've thought about and I think would be helpful. One example is like a while back, we worked with Olympus and we redid the brand work and the new website with all the 3D stuff for them that you see today. And one thing that we found that really helped was having a pretty strong set of guidelines around design work that we do when you're working with like a DAO or anyone that has like a lot of contributors that are coming from all places, is agree upon a very strict centralized set of rules so that anything that gets created can be objectively measured against that centralized set of rules on whether it's on brand or not, right? I think it's really difficult if there's not guidance around, hey, here's what our typography system is, and here's what our color system is. And from a UI perspective, here's the main core components we use. If a contributor then kind of brings something that feels off brand, or maybe from a design or UI perspective, doesn't feel like it aligns for a certain part of the protocol, right? It's difficult because then it turns into a subjective discussion, right? And it's hard. Everyone has different opinions. Is this color better than this color? Is this UI component good to use versus not? So I think it all comes down for us to maybe just building better centralized rules and guidelines, which again can be updated and created in a decentralized way, but to have that source of truth maintained somewhere, to basically kind of evaluate and give feedback and ship product in a more decentralized manner is pretty helpful. It's really the same thing that happens in a company as even more standard Web2 companies get large. The same effect happens, right? Is they start to look more like decentralized orgs if there's not good centralized kind of decision making around frameworks and how to measure brand and things like that, right? You start to see fractaling happen and people create things that look off brand and a lot of cycles spent on like revisions and things of that nature. So yeah, I don't have a better answer for maybe like how to better like incentivize DAOs in ways that like, create work that feels on brand often in a more consistent way. But I think for those that are actively contributing, it feels like just having good centralized rule sets around guidelines, around brand and UI is kind of a really helpful thing.
Well, Jeffrey and everyone else who's here, thank you so much again for coming in. This was a super great presentation. I definitely learned a lot, so hopefully others on the call did as well. And thank you to the fellows for asking questions.
Thank you, Ali, and the whole Variant team for putting this together, and thanks everyone for coming. This was a lot of fun.